Good evening, once again, humble viewer. Settle in and let the noise of the modern world fall away. We are about to journey back once more, not to the courts of kings or the fields of great battles, but into the deep, often deliberately ignored shadows of the past. Our subject tonight is a figure who stood at the very center of medieval law, yet was forced to live at its absolute margins. A man whose public function was a stark and brutal spectacle, but whose private life was a fortress of mandated silence. As we start, feel free to leave a comment below. It is a quiet comfort to know where you are joining us from, and what the hour of the day or night might be for you. It connects us, a small community of quiet listeners scattered across the globe yet united in this moment of tranquil inquiry. Tonight, we explore the secretive life of the medieval executioner. The image that springs to mind is one of brutishness and monstrosity. A hulking, anonymous figure in a black hood, his face hidden, his identity synonymous with the axe or the noose. But this is a caricature, a grotesque mask created by the very society that required his services. To truly understand this figure, we must look past the scaffold and the jeering crowd. We must follow him home. We must enter the world of the man who lived with death as his trade, and for whom secrecy was not a choice, but the fundamental condition of his existence. The year of our Lord, 1412. The reign of Henry IV is nearing its turbulent end, a reign forged in usurpation and maintained through constant struggle. In the great halls of London, men whisper of succession and the wildness of the young Prince Hal. But here, in the walled northern city of Northgate, a prosperous hub of the wool trade, the concerns are more immediate, more visceral. They are the concerns of commerce, of guild law, and of the king's justice, which, in its final, terrible expression, requires a steady hand and a strong stomach. The city of Northgate is a jewel of its kind, nestled within a protective embrace of high stone walls, its skyline a forest of church spires and the steep gabled roofs of wealthy merchants. By day, its narrow, winding streets teem with a vibrant, chaotic life. The air is a thick tapestry of smells, the rich aroma of baking bread from the baker's guild, the sharp, acrid tang of the tanneries near the river, the scent of livestock being driven to market, and the ever-present pervasive odor of wood smoke and unwashed humanity. It is a city of sound, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestone, the shouts of vendors, the peal of church bells marking the hours, and the constant low hum of 1,000 simultaneous conversations. It is a city of community, of tightly woven guilds and parishes, a place where every man knows his neighbor and his station. Yet for one man, this community is a thing to be observed, not experienced. His home is not on a bustling street or in a cozy quarter. He lives in the Rook's Tower, a stark, lonely stone structure built directly into the city's western wall, near the less used Postern Gate. It is a place of strategic importance, meant to guard the wall, but it has been ceded to him and his predecessors for generations. Its primary function, now one of isolation. The tower keeps the city safe from invaders without, and it keeps its most necessary, yet most reviled servants separate from the populace within. To reach it, one must walk a narrow, neglected path along the inside of the wall, a path most citizens of Northgate take pains to avoid. From the high, narrow windows of his tower, the man can see the entire city spread out before him like a living map. He can watch the currents of life flow through its streets, can see the merchants setting up their stalls in the morning and the lamplighters moving through the dusk. He sees the city, he hears its distant, muffled roar, but he is not of it. He is a man perpetually looking down from a height, a watcher on the wall of his own society. His name is Abel. He is not the monster of popular imagination. He is a man in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, not from unnatural size, but from the demands of his work. His hair is dark and cropped short for practicality. His face is plain, square-jawed, and marked by a deep, habitual quietness. His eyes are his most notable feature, a pale, watchful grey, accustomed to assessing things with a calm, dispassionate eye, be it the tension of a rope, the edge of a blade, or the fear in a condemned man's face. There is a stillness about him, a containment of energy that sets him apart. Other men of his size and strength swagger or boast. Abel moves with a quiet economy, as if trying to take up less space in the world than his body requires. The interior of his tower reflects this contained nature. It is a place of surprising, almost obsessive, cleanliness. The stone floors are swept bare, the wooden furniture scrubbed to a pale sheen. There is no clutter, no unnecessary ornamentation. This tidiness is a quiet rebellion against the filth of his trade, a personal battle to maintain order in a life defined by the brutal disorder of state-sanctioned death. He lives here with his wife, Elena. She is a thin, pale woman with hair the color of flax, her face beautiful but etched with a permanent defensive sorrow. She is the daughter of the previous executioner, Abel's master, and this life is the only one she has ever known. Their marriage was a transaction, a passing of the trade from one generation to the next, but it has, over the years, settled into a bond of deep, silent companionship. They are two shipwrecked souls on a deserted island, and they are all the world to each other because the rest of the world has cast them out. Their life together is a ritual of quietude. They speak little, communicating in gestures and shared glances, a language developed over years of profound isolation. When Elena goes to the market, she is a ghost. The vendors will serve her, taking her coin, but they do not meet her eyes. They will often wash their hands after she has moved on. The other women pull their children close as she passes, whispering prayers or curses behind her back. She is the executioner's wife, and the taint of her husband's trade is upon her as surely as if it were a visible stain. She bears this public shunning with a stony practiced dignity, but Abel sees the cost in the tightness of her shoulders when she returns, in the way she scrubs her hands with a fierce, repetitive motion. Abel's work is not confined to the spectacle of the scaffold. He is a man of many grim and necessary functions. He is the city's knacker, responsible for the disposal of diseased livestock, a task that often requires him to go out into the fields beyond the walls, where he is met with the same fearful avoidance by the farmers. He possesses a rough, practical knowledge of anatomy, gleaned from his grim work, which sometimes leads to the strangest of consultations. A man with a badly broken bone, whom the physicians have given up on, might be brought to the rook's tower under cover of darkness, for it is known that the executioner has a strong and steady hand for setting shattered limbs. He is paid for this service, but it is never acknowledged. He is a healer who must never be seen. The tools of his primary trade are not displayed. They are kept in a heavy, locked oak chest in the lowest level of the tower. Within, wrapped in oiled cloth, lies the great, two-handed executioner's sword, its blade wide and heavy, its edge maintained with a whetstone and a religious devotion. There is also the axe, a cruder instrument for a different kind of work. There are coils of new rope, branding irons with the city's crest, iron manacles, and a collection of smaller, more specialized knives. To Abel, these are not objects of horror. They are the instruments of his craft, and he cares for them with the same dispassionate professionalism a carpenter shows his saws and chisels. To maintain them is to ensure a swift and efficient performance of his duty. In a world where his every action is judged, he prides himself on his competence. A clean cut is the only form of mercy he is permitted to offer. The call to duty, when it comes, is a violation of the fragile peace of his home. It arrives as a sharp, official knock on the heavy oak door of his tower. Not the timid tap of a desperate patient, but the hard, demanding rap of the law. Tonight, the knock comes just after dusk. Abel and Elena are sharing a simple meal of bread and salted fish. At the sound, Elena freezes, her hand hovering over her cup. A look of familiar dread passes across her face. Abel places his hand over hers for a brief moment, a silent reassurance, before rising to answer the door. Standing on the threshold is a young deputy of the city's reeve, his face pale and nervous, his eyes studiously avoiding Abel's. The deputy does not enter. He stands on the path, holding out a rolled parchment sealed with the city's crest. He relays the information in a clipped, formal tone. A man, a wool merchant convicted of murder, is to be executed in the main square at midday in 2 days' time. The sentence is death by beheading. The deputy hands Abel the warrant, the official paper feeling like a lead weight in his hand. The deputy then turns and walks away quickly, without another word, eager to be gone from this tainted place. Abel closes the door, the heavy bolt sliding home with a sound of profound finality. He does not need to read the warrant. He knows what it signifies. The quiet rhythm of his life has been broken. For the next 2 days, he will not be Abel the husband, the keeper of a quiet home. He must become the executioner of Northgate. He looks at Elena, and in her eyes he sees not just fear for him, but a weary resignation to the ritual that is about to unfold. Her husband must once again put on the invisible, hated mask of his profession and perform his terrible part in the great theatre of justice. He does not eat the rest of his meal. He descends the winding stone stairs to the ground floor of the tower, to the locked oak chest. He turns the heavy iron key in the lock, the sound echoing in the small, cold room. He lifts the heavy lid. The smell of oil and old iron fills the air. He reaches in, and with a practiced, steady hand, he lifts out the great sword, its polished steel catching the faint candlelight with a cold, hungry gleam. He unwraps it from its cloth and begins the slow, methodical process of checking its edge. His touch gentle, precise, and terrible. This is his true and secret life, not the brief public spectacle of death, but the long, quiet, lonely preparation for it. He is a craftsman preparing for his work, an instrument of the law making himself ready, and in the silence of his tower, surrounded by the tools of his trade, he is the loneliest man in the city of Northgate. The turning of the heavy iron key in the lock of the great oak chest was the true beginning. It was a sound that marked a definitive transition, a crossing of an invisible threshold in Abel's life and home. The air in the lower chamber of the Rook's Tower, usually cool and smelling faintly of damp stone and dried herbs, was instantly transformed. As the heavy lid creaked open, it released a complex and potent scent, the sharp metallic tang of cold steel, the deep, resinous aroma of polishing oils, and the faint, ghostly smell of old leather and whetstone dust. This was not the smell of a workshop. It was the scent of a grim inheritance, a condensed history of the city's final judgments. This odor, more than any proclamation or warrant, was the signal that the public face of death was being awakened from its slumber. For Elena, moving quietly in the living quarters above, this familiar scent was an invasion. It crept up the winding stone staircase like an invisible mist, permeating the very fabric of their carefully constructed domestic peace. It was the smell that had haunted the periphery of her entire existence. As a child, she had known it as the sign that her father was preparing to leave, that for a day he would cease to be the man who taught her how to tend the rooftop garden, and would instead become the terrifying, hooded figure from the whispers of other children. Now it was the smell that heralded her husband's temporary departure from their shared world of quiet companionship. She continued her tasks, scrubbing a wooden trencher with a fierce, concentrated energy, her knuckles white. But each motion was an act of defiance against the encroaching reality from below. She was trying to scour away a smell that was not in the wood, but in the air, in her memory, in the very foundation of their lives. For Abel, the lower chamber was a sanctuary of purpose. The moment he descended the stairs, the anxieties and compromises of the world above fell away. He was no longer the man who endured the averted gazes in the marketplace, no longer the husband whose presence brought a shadow to his wife's face. Down here, surrounded by the honest, functional reality of his tools, his identity was clear, his function absolute. He lit a thick tallow lamp, the flames sputtering to life and casting long, dancing shadows that made the stone walls seem to press in closer. His movements were not rushed, they were deliberate, liturgical, each action part of a well-established and deeply necessary ritual. His first and most profound duty was to the sword. It lay in the chest, shrouded in oiled cloth, a sleeping leviathan. It was an object of both immense practicality and powerful symbolism. Eleanor's father, a man of few words but deep professional pride, had passed on its history as he had passed on its use. It was, he had said, the city's conscience-made steel, forged in the great fire-hearted workshops of Solingen in a time before their grandfathers were born. Its purpose was not murder, but the swift, clean, and unambiguous conclusion of a legal process. To wield it was not an act of passion, but the final mechanical turning of the law's great wheel. Abel lifted it from the chest, its weight a familiar and sobering presence in his hands. He laid it with surgical precision upon a long, narrow workbench hewn from a single, massive piece of oak. The ritual of inspection began. He did not look at the blade first, he felt it. Closing his eyes for a moment to heighten his other senses, he ran the calloused, sensitive ball of his thumb down the entire length of the cutting edge, from the hilt to the tip. It was a touch of incredible lightness, a caress that sought imperfection. He was searching for the infinitesimal, the tiny nick from a previous use that might have been missed, the microscopic burr in the steel that could catch on a sinew or a piece of gristle, turning a clean severance into a hacking, prolonged agony. The crowd might not know the difference, but he would. And in the silent judgment of his own craft, a botched cut was the only true failure. He felt nothing but a single, continuous, perfect edge. Satisfied, he opened his eyes. He then took a piece of soft, supple deerskin, which he kept soaking in a sealed clay pot of fragrant oil. He wrung it out until it was damp but not dripping, and began the long, meditative process of polishing the blade. His movements were slow, circular, and rhythmic, his shoulders and back moving in concert with his hands. This was more than mere cleaning. It was a form of communion. It was his way of emptying his mind, of purging the distracting emotions of pity for the condemned or resentment for his own station. All that was left was the feel of the leather on the steel, the faint whisper of the motion, the steady, even rhythm of his own breathing. He was honing not just the sword, but himself, preparing his own spirit for the cold, clear focus that the task would demand. While Abel was engaged in this private, solemn rite, the city of Northgate was alive with a very public and feverish energy. The impending execution of the wool merchant was the subject of every conversation. In the taverns, men who had known him argued over his guilt or innocence, their voices loud with ale and moral certainty. In the marketplace, women whispered of the victim, the brutal nature of the murder, and the terrible fate awaiting the killer. The event took on the character of a great festival, but one of a dark and morbid kind. Traveling peddlers, smelling an opportunity, began to make their way towards the city, hoping to sell cheap relics, ballads of the murder, and meat pies to the crowds that would gather. The execution was no longer about one man's crime. It was becoming a civic spectacle, a raw and thrilling piece of public theatre, and the entire populace was abuzz with anticipation for the final act. The following morning, Abel himself had to enter this buzzing, expectant world. He left the sanctuary of his tower, his face hidden within the deep cowl of his plain, dark cloak. He was not just shielding his identity. He was creating a barrier, a small, mobile pocket of silence and anonymity to carry with him through the noisy, staring city. He walked the path along the wall, his heavy boots making no sound on the dusty earth. His journey to the main square was a passage through a world that was preparing for a show in which he was the unwilling star. In the center of the square, the scaffold was nearly complete. A team of stout, aproned carpenters were driving the last of the wooden pegs into place, their hammers ringing out with a cheerful, industrious sound that was horribly at odds with the structure's purpose. As Abel approached, a hush fell over them. Their laughter and banter ceased. They put down their tools, wiped their hands on their aprons, and stepped back, ceding the space to him. They looked at him with a mixture of professional respect for a fellow craftsman and a deep, instinctual revulsion. Abel began his inspection. His process was painstaking and methodical. He was not just looking, he was interrogating the structure with his senses. He placed his hands on the main support beams, leaning his full weight against them, feeling for any hint of weakness or give in the joinery. He walked the perimeter of the platform, his boots testing the solidity of the planks. A collapse or even a loud crack of wood during the proceedings would be a catastrophic disruption. He then mounted the steps, each one taking his weight with a solid, reassuring thud. He was assessing it as a workspace, a stage upon which a terrible, precise, and irreversible act would be performed. His focus narrowed to the block. It was a single massive section of an oak trunk, its surface weathered to a silvery grey but stained with a dark, almost black patch in its centre, a ghostly map of previous sentences carried out. He knelt, running his bare hand over its surface, not feeling for splinters, but for its texture, its grain. He then stood and looked at it from the angle where he would stand and from the imagined angle of the condemned man. He visualized the final moments, the kneeling, the positioning of the neck. He noted that the block was placed in such a way that the midday sun would be directly in the prisoner's eyes, a small, final cruelty of disorientation. He made a minute adjustment, shifting it a hand's breadth to the west with a grunt of effort. The sun would now be at the man's back. It was a small, secret act of mercy, a detail no one else would ever notice or understand. But for Abel, it was a crucial assertion of his own grim agency in the process. He then took a piece of soft, supple deerskin, which he kept soaking in a sealed clay pot of fragrant oil. He wrung it out until it was damp but not dripping, and began the long, meditative process of polishing the blade. His movements were slow, circular, and rhythmic, his shoulders and back moving in concert with his hands. This was more than mere cleaning. It was a form of communion. It was his way of emptying his mind, of purging the distracting emotions of pity for the condemned or resentment for his own station. All that was left was the feel of the leather on the steel, the faint whisper of the motion, the steady, even rhythm of his own breathing. He was honing not just the sword, but himself, preparing his own spirit for the cold, clear focus that the task would demand. While Abel was engaged in this private, solemn rite, the city of Northgate was alive with a very public and feverish energy. The impending execution of the wool merchant was the subject of every conversation. In the taverns, men who had known him argued over his guilt or innocence, their voices loud with ale and moral certainty. In the marketplace, women whispered of the victim, the brutal nature of the murder, and the terrible fate awaiting the killer. The event took on the character of a great festival, but one of a dark and morbid kind. Traveling peddlers, smelling an opportunity, began to make their way towards the city, hoping to sell cheap relics, ballads of the murder, and meat pies to the crowds that would gather. The execution was no longer about one man's crime. It was becoming a civic spectacle, a raw and thrilling piece of public theatre, and the entire populace was abuzz with anticipation for the final act. The following morning, Abel himself had to enter this buzzing, expectant world. He left the sanctuary of his tower, his face hidden within the deep cowl of his plain, dark cloak. He was not just shielding his identity. He was creating a barrier, a small, mobile pocket of silence and anonymity to carry with him through the noisy, staring city. He walked the path along the wall, his heavy boots making no sound on the dusty earth. His journey to the main square was a passage through a world that was preparing for a show in which he was the unwilling star. In the center of the square, the scaffold was nearly complete. A team of stout, aproned carpenters were driving the last of the wooden pegs into place, their hammers ringing out with a cheerful, industrious sound that was horribly at odds with the structure's purpose. As Abel approached, a hush fell over them. Their laughter and banter ceased. They put down their tools, wiped their hands on their aprons, and stepped back, ceding the space to him. They looked at him with a mixture of professional respect for a fellow craftsman and a deep, instinctual revulsion. Abel began his inspection. His process was painstaking and methodical. He was not just looking, he was interrogating the structure with his senses. He placed his hands on the main support beams, leaning his full weight against them, feeling for any hint of weakness or give in the joinery. He walked the perimeter of the platform, his boots testing the solidity of the planks. A collapse or even a loud crack of wood during the proceedings would be a catastrophic disruption. He then mounted the steps, each one taking his weight with a solid, reassuring thud. He was assessing it as a workspace, a stage upon which a terrible, precise, and irreversible act would be performed. His focus narrowed to the block. It was a single massive section of an oak trunk, its surface weathered to a silvery grey but stained with a dark, almost black patch in its centre, a ghostly map of previous sentences carried out. He knelt, running his bare hand over its surface, not feeling for splinters, but for its texture, its grain. He then stood and looked at it from the angle where he would stand, and from the imagined angle of the condemned man. He visualized the final moments, the kneeling, the positioning of the neck. He noted that the block was placed in such a way that the midday sun would be directly in the prisoner's eyes, a small, final cruelty of disorientation. He made a minute adjustment, shifting it a hand's breadth to the west with a grunt of effort. The sun would now be at the man's back. It was a small, secret act of mercy, a detail no one else would ever notice or understand. But for Abel, it was a crucial assertion of his own grim agency in the process. The dawn that broke over the city of Northgate on the day of the execution was not the familiar, gentle herald of a new day's commerce. It was a raw and nervous light, illuminating a city that was holding its collective breath. The air itself felt different, thin, and charged with a static, nervous energy. From the high, solitary vantage of the Rook's Tower, Abel observed the transformation. The city, usually a creature of predictable habits, was in the grip of a fever. Even before the sky had fully transitioned from the deep, bruised purple of late night to the pale grey of morning, the first human tributaries began to flow, trickling from the dark mouths of alleyways and side streets, all converging on the great, open basin of the main square. These were not the early rising artisans or merchants. These were the spectators, the pilgrims of the scaffold, staking their claim to a good vantage point from which to witness the state-sanctioned taking of a life. Abel himself had not courted sleep. He had met the dawn on his own terms, sitting bolt upright on a hard wooden stool in the still, dark chamber, his mind a quiet and deliberate void. This was the final and most crucial stage of his internal preparation, a conscious act of self-erasure. He systematically set aside the man named Abel, the husband who felt the sting of his wife's silent sorrow, the man who found a quiet satisfaction in a well-tended rooftop garden, the citizen who felt the weight of his community's revulsion. What was left was the function, the office, the stark and simple identity of the executioner. It was a state of profound meditative calm, a fortress of focus built to withstand the emotional storm that was to come. As the first true light illuminated the room, he rose. His movements were fluid and economical, betraying none of the stiffness of a sleepless night. He drank a single cup of water, cold from the earthenware jug. Food was an impossibility. His work required an empty, settled stomach. He then began the ritual of dressing, a physical transformation that mirrored his internal one. This was not the donning of a disguise, but the assumption of a uniform, every piece of which was imbued with a deep, functional significance. He started with the heavy, dark wool braise and a simple, collarless linen shirt, clean and stark white. Over this, he pulled the jerkin. It was not the supple leather of a gentleman's riding coat, but a thick, rigid garment of boiled leather, its surface treated with layers of blackened wax until it was nearly as hard as wood. It was a piece of practical armor, its purpose not to stop a blade but to defend him from the visceral reality of the crowd. It would deflect the spittle of the contemptuous, the rotten apple thrown by a moralist, the desperate clutch of a prisoner's grieving family member. It was a tangible barrier, a second skin that declared his separateness, his untouchability. The heavy woolen cloak came next, its deep cowl designed not as a theatrical mask but as a practical shroud for his face. With his head bowed at the correct, practiced angle, the shadows of the cowl would render his features indistinct, transforming his face from that of a specific man into a generalized effigy of implacable justice. Finally, he buckled on the thick leather belt. It held no weapons of aggression, only a single, heavy-sheathed utility knife, a tool for cutting the ropes that would bind the prisoner, its purpose one of control, not violence. The final effect was not demonic or monstrous, it was something far more chilling, the embodiment of grim, impersonal, bureaucratic death. He was a functionary of the state, dressed for a messy and unpleasant but necessary civic task. Elena, who had been sitting by the window since before he rose, watched this transformation in silence. Her face was a pale, stoic mask, but her hands, tightly clasped in her lap, betrayed the tension that thrummed beneath the surface. This was the moment she lost her husband, the moment he was consumed by the public effigy. She rose and retrieved the two long, cloth-wrapped bundles he had prepared the night before. She held them out to him. Her fingers brushed against his for a fleeting second as he took them, a brief spark of human contact in a ritual of dehumanization. He gave her a single, sharp nod, their only permitted goodbye. And then he turned and was gone, his heavy boots sounding a slow, deliberate rhythm on the stone stairs. Elena did not watch him go. She remained in the room, which now felt colder and emptier, and began her own vigil of waiting for the sound of the church bells that would signal the end. Abel stepped out into a city that was a living, breathing beast of anticipation. He carried the shrouded instruments in his left arm, tucked close to his body, their weight a familiar, grounding presence. He walked his lonely path along the inner wall, a silent, dark river moving against the great, noisy tide of humanity that surged towards the square. The glares and whispers that usually followed him were more intense today, charged with the morbid excitement of the occasion. He registered them as he would register the wind or the rain, as a condition of the environment, not as a personal address. His focus was already far ahead, on the wooden platform and the task that awaited him there. His destination was not the square, but the city jail. A cordon of a dozen city guardsmen, their steel caps gleaming, their ash pikes held at a rigid angle, surrounded the grim stone building, holding back a restive, pressing crowd. The captain of the guard, a barrel-chested veteran named Marcus, whose face was a roadmap of old battles, met Abel at the gate. Marcus, a man for whom duty superseded all other considerations, was one of the few individuals in Northgate who would address Abel directly. Their exchange was a masterpiece of functional brevity. They confirmed the route. They confirmed the signal, the first toll of the great bell of St. Peter's. They confirmed the number of guards for the procession. There was no small talk, no acknowledgement of the grimness of their shared task. It was the conversation of two professionals ensuring the smooth operation of a complex piece of civic machinery. Abel was then escorted into the jail itself. The stench inside was a physical blow, a thick, gagging miasma of stale sweat, human waste, and profound despair. In a small, straw-strewn cell, illuminated by a single sputtering torch, the final private act of the drama was unfolding. Thomas Fletcher, the condemned wool merchant, was on his knees. He was no longer the prosperous, respected burgher he had once been. He was a broken thing, clad in the stark white, shroud-like shift of the condemned. His face was the colour of old parchment, his eyes wide and vacant with a terror that had taken him past pleading or screaming into a state of hollowed-out shock. Father Michael, the priest, was at his side, holding a crucifix to his lips, his own hand trembling as he recited the Latin prayers for the dying. Abel's entrance brought a new, sharper terror into the cell. The priest flinched. The prisoner made a low, animal sound of pure dread. Abel, however, did not look at the man's face. His professional gaze was analytical. He assessed the man's physical state, his hands, the thickness of his neck, the broadness of his shoulders. These were the only details that mattered now, the practical variables of his craft. He took a length of thick cord from a pouch on his belt and approached the kneeling man. He moved with a quiet, unhurried deliberation that was more terrifying than any overt threat. He gestured for the prisoner to put his hands behind his back. Fletcher, moving like a man in a dream, complied. Abel's hands were swift, firm, and impersonal as he bound the merchant's wrists, the knots practiced and non-negotiable. This physical act of binding was the true point of no return, the moment the prisoner ceased to be a man and became an object to be moved, positioned, and ultimately disposed of by the apparatus of the law. At that moment, from across the city, the first toll of the great bell of St. Peter's sounded. It was a deep, resonant bronze boom that vibrated in the stones of the jail and in the very bones of the men inside. It was the signal. The procession began. The great iron-studded doors of the jail were thrown open, revealing a wall of sound and a sea of faces. The crowd, held back by the pikes of the guard, was a roiling, shouting mass. A collective groan and gasp went up as the prisoner, blinking in the sudden daylight, was escorted out. He was a stark white figure, a living ghost, flanked by the black-robed priest on one side and the towering, dark-cowled form of the executioner on the other. The walk to the square was a passage through a gauntlet of human emotion at its most raw. Shouts of "murderer" and "justice" mingled with screamed prayers and cries of "God have mercy on your soul." Clumps of mud, rotten cabbage leaves, and filth from the street arced through the air, mostly striking the guards, who bore it with stoic indifference. Abel walked through this sensory inferno as if encased in a bubble of profound silence. His focus was absolute. His hand rested on the prisoner's elbow, a grip of iron-like steadiness. He was not there to comfort, but to control. He was the grim shepherd, ensuring his charge reached the altar of sacrifice without collapsing. Fletcher stumbled badly once, his knees buckling, a strangled sob breaking from his lips. Abel's grip tightened instantly, hauling him upright with an almost contemptuous strength, propelling him forward. The procession could not be allowed to falter. The ritual demanded a steady, solemn pace. They finally emerged into the vast, seething arena of the main square. It was a breathtaking spectacle of humanity. Every window, every balcony, every rooftop was a dense tapestry of spectators. In the very center, raised above the sea of heads, stood the stark, waiting scaffold. As Abel led the prisoner up the wooden steps, a profound hush began to fall over the immense crowd. The cacophony of jeers and shouts died away, replaced by a sound of 10,000 people holding their breath. They were ascending into the sacred, silent space of the stage. Once on the platform, Abel was in his element. This was his workspace, his kingdom. He was the director, the priest, and the final actor in this terrible play. He positioned the prisoner in the center, facing the crowd for a final public viewing. He gave a nod to the priest, who stepped forward and offered a last trembling prayer for the condemned man's soul, his voice sounding thin and fragile in the vast, silent square. When the priest stepped back, the stage belonged to Abel. With a slow, deliberate movement, he unwrapped the great sword. The sun, now high in the sky, caught the wide, polished blade, sending a blinding flash of light across the square. A collective serpentine hiss of awe and terror went through the crowd. This was the moment of revelation, the unveiling of the holy instrument of death. Abel took his stance, his feet planted wide and firm on the wooden planks, the sword held loosely in a two-handed grip before him. He did not look at the crowd, he looked only at the back of the prisoner's neck. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was the final, silent command. Thomas Fletcher, the wool merchant, his will long since extinguished, collapsed to his knees. With the slow, docile movement of an animal at the slaughter, he lowered his head and placed his neck upon the dark, scarred wood of the block. He was now perfectly positioned. The crowd, the city, the world, all of it had ceased to exist. There was only the executioner, the sword, the kneeling man, and the single, focused moment of terrible, impending purpose. The moment the prisoner's knees touched the rough wood of the platform, the character of the day changed. The nervous, festive energy of the crowd, the morbid excitement that had buzzed through the city since dawn, collapsed into a silence so profound and absolute that it seemed to have a physical weight. It pressed down on the square, smothering the distant sounds of the city, muffling the rustle of the wind against the Guildhall's banners. It was a sacred silence, a vacuum created by the collective gaze of 10,000 souls, all focused with a singular, primal intensity on the raised stage. The world had become a vast open-air cathedral, and a terrible sacrament was about to be performed. For Abel, standing in the center of this immense, silent attention, the silence was not an emptiness but a perfect vessel. It was the clean, still air of his workshop, the controlled environment necessary for a task of ultimate precision. He was the calm eye in a hurricane of human emotion. He stood behind the kneeling, white-shifted figure of Thomas Fletcher, his own dark, solid form a stark counterpoint. His feet, clad in their heavy leather boots, were planted shoulder-width apart on the scaffold's planks, a stance of unshakable stability he had practiced until it was as natural as his own posture. The great two-handed sword was not yet a weapon. It was a tool held in a state of patient readiness, its point angled towards the floorboards, his grip on the leather-wrapped hilt, firm but devoid of tension. This was the moment his years of discipline, his long night of mental purgation, came to fruition. His mind was a placid lake, reflecting only the reality of the task before him. Pity had been banished. Anger was an unaffordable luxury. The complex tapestry of the man's life, guilt and sin was a matter for God and the magistrates. His domain was now purely one of physics and anatomy. His professional gaze narrowed, excluding the kneeling man's slumped shoulders, his trembling hands, everything but the specific vulnerable target, a 3-inch swathe of pale, exposed neck. He clinically observed the tautness of the sinews, the slight, terrified pulse beating just beneath the skin. He mentally mapped the vertebrae beneath, calculating the precise point of impact that would guarantee a clean, instantaneous severance, avoiding the tough, unforgiving bone of the jaw above or the clavicle below. A miscalculation of a single inch would mean horror, a botched spectacle, a betrayal of his grim craft. He took one final, slow, deep breath, pulling the silence of the square into his own lungs, then exhaled half of it, his body settling into a state of absolute preternatural stillness. There was no signal from a magistrate, no drum roll. He operated on his own internal timing. The movement, when it began, was not the sudden, brutal action the crowd might have expected. It was a slow, deliberate, almost balletic motion of pure, controlled power. The great sword began its ascent. The motion originated in his legs, traveled up through the coiled strength of his hips and torso, and was finally expressed through his arms. It was the fluid, practiced grace of a master craftsman, a woodsman felling an ancient tree with a single, perfect swing. The blade rose in a high, shimmering arc, the broad, polished steel catching the full force of the midday sun, painting a brilliant, terrifying crescent of light against the canvas of the sky. For one heart-stopping, eternal moment, the sword hung at the apex of its journey, a point of perfect, weightless equilibrium between the gathering of energy and its inevitable, violent release. Then, gravity and will combined, and the blade fell. It was not a hacking chop, but a focused, guided, and utterly unstoppable descent. The air itself seemed to part before it, a faint, clean hiss that was the only sound in the silent world. The blade met the target. The sound was not the loud crack the crowd might have imagined, but a dense, shockingly intimate noise, a wet, solid thud that spoke of the severing of flesh and bone and life. It was a sound that seemed to be absorbed by the wood of the block and the bodies of the onlookers, a sound felt deep in the gut. The result of the perfect arc was a perfect, clean severance. For a ghastly, surreal moment, the body of Thomas Fletcher remained kneeling, as if unaware of its own death, before a geyser of bright, shockingly vivid arterial red erupted from the stump of its neck. The head, completely detached, fell with a soft, clumsy weight onto the wooden platform, rolled a few inches, and came to rest with its eyes wide open, locked in a final expression of bewildered terror. The headless torso then slumped forward, collapsing into a twitching, inanimate heap of white linen and spilling lifeblood. The silence of the crowd broke. It was not a cheer or a scream, but a single, massive, involuntary sound, a great, shuddering, collective gasp of awe, of horror, of a deep and terrible catharsis. The tension that had held 10,000 people in its grip was released in one explosive exhalation. The play was over. Justice, in its most brutal and spectacular form, had been done. Abel's work, however, was not yet complete. The spectacle demanded a gruesome epilogue. He did not pause to look at his handiwork. He did not look at the crowd. He moved with the same impersonal efficiency that had defined his every action. He had pulled on a thick, hardened leather gauntlet before the final swing, and now he used it. He stepped forward, nudged the head with the toe of his boot so that it faced outwards, and then bent down. He grasped a handful of the dead man's blood-matted hair and lifted the head high. This was the monstrance, the showing, the undeniable proof. He held the grisly trophy aloft, turning slowly, deliberately, from left to right, a priest displaying a holy relic. He ensured that every corner of the square, from the wealthy merchants on their balconies to the poor apprentices on the rooftops, could see the face of the man who had broken the law. He held it until the image was burned into the city's collective memory. The crowd, seeing this, found its voice again. A roar went up, a complex symphony of grim approval, superstitious fear, and primal excitement. This was the true climax, the image that would become legend. His final duty on the platform complete, he let the head drop with a casual finality. It landed with a dull thud on the now blood-soaked planks. He turned his back on the scene, on the cooling body and the staring head, as if they were nothing more than the debris of a completed task. He produced a coarse piece of sacking from his belt and wiped the great sword clean with a few swift, practical strokes, removing the blood and matter before it could tarnish the steel. He then wrapped the blade once more in its black linen shroud. The instrument of death was now dormant, its purpose fulfilled. He picked up the smaller, unused axe and, without a single backward glance at the carnage he had wrought, descended the scaffold steps. Instantly, the city guards closed ranks around him, their pikes forming a bristling, protective cage. The mood of the crowd, its thirst for spectacle now sated, was already beginning to sour. The collective awe curdled into a more familiar, targeted revulsion. The hero of the drama, now that his part was played, was once again the villain. As Abel was escorted away from the square, the insults began. Shouts of "butcher," "gallows crow," "blood drinker" followed him. He was no longer the impersonal instrument of the law, he was now the man with blood on his hands, the focal point for the crowd's post-spectacle guilt and disgust. He was led not to his home, but back to the jail, for the final, sordid part of the transaction. In the same small, grim office, the Reeves clerk waited, his face pinched with distaste. The clerk refused to meet Abel's eyes, focusing instead on the columns of his ledger as he counted out the silver coins. The clinking of the silver on the wood was an obscene sound in the quiet room. It was the price of a human life, the fee for a service no one else would perform. This blood money was the ultimate symbol of his outcast status, a transaction that set him entirely apart from the normal commerce of the city. Abel took the heavy purse, its weight both a comfort and a curse. He dipped a quill in ink and signed his name in the ledger, a simple, steady Abel, an act of literacy that further widened the gulf between him and the common folk. The walk back to the Rook's Tower was a journey through a city trying to forget. The square was already being swarmed by a cleanup crew, men throwing sand over the bloodstains and dismantling the scaffold with a brisk, businesslike efficiency, eager to erase the evidence of the morning's brutal ritual. But the psychic stain remained. As Abel walked his solitary path, he was a pariah. People saw him coming and would cross the street or duck into doorways. Mothers would physically shield their children's eyes from the sight of him. He was a walking memento mori, a reminder of what they had all just witnessed and enjoyed. When he finally reached the sanctuary of his tower and bolted the heavy door behind him, a wave of exhaustion so profound it was like a physical illness washed over him. The armor of the executioner fell away, and the man, Abel, was left, trembling and hollow. Eleanor was there. She had not been idle. A large wooden tub filled with steaming, lye-scented water was waiting for him. She did not speak, but her eyes searched his face, looking for the husband she had lost that morning. He stripped off the stiff, foul-smelling garments. He plunged his hands, his forearms, his entire head into the scalding water, scrubbing with a block of harsh soap until his skin was red and raw. It was a desperate, frantic ritual of purification, an attempt to wash away the scent of blood, the grime of the jail, the psychic filth of the crowd's adoration and hatred. He was trying to baptize himself back into his own humanity, but as he stood there, dripping and shivering in the quiet of his stone fortress, he knew that some stains were not on the skin, they were on the soul, and no amount of soap or water could ever truly wash them clean. In the immediate aftermath of an execution, a strange and profound quiet would descend upon the Rook's Tower, a quiet that was deeper and more absolute than the usual solitude of Abel's life. It was the quiet of convalescence, not of the body, but of the soul. For 2 full days following the beheading of the wool merchant, Abel did not leave the tower. The world outside, with its whispers and its stares, could not be faced. He and Elena existed in a state of mutual, unspoken understanding. The lower chamber, where the tools of his trade now lay cleaned and shrouded in their chest, was locked. The heavy, waxed leather jerkin was hung in an outer shed to air out the ghosts of the crowd. Abel himself moved through their small living quarters with a slow, deliberate lethargy, the adrenaline and intense focus of the execution having given way to a deep, cavernous exhaustion. This period of seclusion was a necessary ritual of decompression. He was slowly, painstakingly shedding the skin of the executioner and attempting to re-inhabit the self of the man named Abel. It was a difficult and incomplete process. He would find himself staring at his own hands, marveling at their ability to tend a plant or carve a piece of wood, yet unable to forget their other, more terrible capability. At night, sleep was a shallow, troubled sea, and he would often wake from dreams of a falling blade or a silent, watching crowd, the roar of the square still a faint echo in his ears. Elena would tend to him in these days, her presence a constant, silent support. She would prepare simple meals which he would barely touch, and ensure the fire was always lit, as if the warmth and light could hold the encroaching shadows at bay. They were like two people tending to a man recovering from a grave illness, an illness of the spirit contracted in the performance of his duty. The purse of silver coins, his fee from the city, sat on a high shelf, untouched. Its presence was a source of profound ambiguity. The coins represented a form of wealth and security unimaginable to most of the city's inhabitants. They guaranteed a warm home, food on the table, and a degree of independence from the daily struggle for subsistence that defined most lives. But every coin was tainted. Each one was a small, round token of his otherness, a payment for an act that placed him outside the bounds of normal human community. Abel could not bring himself to touch the purse, and Elena seemed to regard it with a kind of superstitious dread, as if it were a cursed object. It was the price of their survival and the emblem of their damnation. On the third day, necessity forced him back out into the world. Their supply of flour was low, and a new blade was needed for his skinning knife, a tool of his less infamous but equally necessary trade as the city's knacker. He chose his time carefully, venturing out in the late afternoon when the streets were less crowded, the energy of the day beginning to wane. He kept his cowl up, his head down, and his pace steady, a dark, silent ship navigating the hostile waters of the city. The reaction of the populace was different now than it had been in the days leading up to the execution. The morbid excitement was gone, replaced by a more settled, more profound form of ostracization. He was no longer a figure of thrilling, terrible anticipation. He was now a historical fact, a walking monument to the city's recent brutality. As he walked, a visible ripple of discomfort moved with him. Conversations would cease as he approached, only to resume in hushed, urgent whispers the moment he had passed. People would flatten themselves against the walls of buildings to avoid the slightest chance of physical contact. A child, chasing a ball into his path, was snatched back by its mother with a cry of terror as if from the path of a leper. The touch of the executioner, even accidental, was believed to be a source of profound and lasting misfortune. He was a man whose very presence was a curse. He conducted his business with the same grim efficiency he applied to all his tasks. At the miller's, he did not enter the shop, but stood in the doorway. He placed his coins on the threshold, stated the amount of flour he required in a low, even voice, and waited. The miller's boy, his face a mask of fear, quickly filled a sack and brought it out, taking the coins without letting their fingers touch and dropping them immediately into a separate pouch, presumably to be washed or kept apart from the ordinary currency of his trade. At the blacksmith's, the transaction was similar. He described the blade he needed, and the smith, a large, powerful man whose own trade was one of fire and force, spoke to him curtly, his eyes fixed on the anvil, never once meeting Abel's gaze. This social death was the air Abel breathed every day. He was accustomed to it, hardened to it, yet it was a heavy cloak to wear. Every averted gaze, every whispered comment, every person who shrank from his path was a small reinforcement of the massive, invisible wall that stood between him and the rest of humanity. He was a citizen of Northgate, yet he was an exile within its walls. He was necessary to the city's order, yet he was a monster in its eyes. This paradox was the central, defining truth of his existence. He was returning to his tower, the sack of flour heavy on his shoulder, when his journey was interrupted. A woman, her face half hidden by a worn shawl, darted out from a narrow alleyway and stood directly in his path. Abel stopped, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. It was highly unusual for anyone to approach him so directly. The woman was thin and haggard, her eyes wide with a desperate, fearful energy. He recognized her as a weaver from the poorer quarter near the river, a woman named Agnes. She spoke in a rushed, terrified whisper, her words tumbling over one another. She begged him, not for mercy or for money, but for help. Her son, a boy of about 10, was sick. He was consumed by a wasting cough, a fever that would not break, and the physicians had bled him and purged him to no avail. They had given him up. But she had heard the whispers, the secret, desperate folklore of the city's underbelly, the stories of the executioner's secret skill. She had heard that the man who knew death so intimately also possessed a strange, dark knowledge of the living body. She believed that the touch that was a curse to the healthy might be a cure for the dying. She begged him to come, to look at her son, to use his terrible knowledge for healing. Abel's first instinct was to refuse. This was a dangerous entanglement. His healing was a secret, a practice shrouded in rumor and conducted only under the cover of darkness. To be seen entering a home in broad daylight would invite questions, suspicion, and possibly the wrath of the city's licensed physicians, who would see his folk medicine as a threat to their authority. He told the woman to go home, that he could not help her, his voice rougher than he intended. But she would not be deterred. She fell to her knees in the middle of the street, clutching at the hem of his cloak, her face streaked with tears. She was beyond caring about taboos or public opinion. She was a mother fighting for her child's life, and she was willing to appeal to the city's devil if she thought he could help. Her raw animal grief was a force that breached the walls of Abel's carefully constructed detachment. He looked down at her, and for a moment he did not see a stranger, a member of the society that shunned him. He saw only the stark, universal face of human suffering. He made a decision. It was an impulsive, reckless act, a departure from the strict rules of survival that governed his life. He gave a short, sharp nod and told her to lead the way. The woman scrambled to her feet, her expression one of stunned, tearful gratitude. She led him through a labyrinth of narrow, foul-smelling alleys into the poorest quarter of the city, a place of sagging, overcrowded tenements and open sewage. They arrived at her dwelling, a single, dark, damp room that she shared with her son. The boy was lying on a thin straw pallet in the corner, his small body frail and trembling. His breathing was a shallow, ragged rasp, and his cough was a deep, wet, hollow sound that seemed to tear at his very lungs. Abel knelt beside him. He ignored the filth of the room, the smell of sickness. He placed his hand on the boy's forehead, a touch that was surprisingly gentle. The boy's skin was burning with fever. Abel then placed his ear against the child's thin chest, listening intently to the sound of his breathing, a diagnostic technique he had learned from years of assessing the health of condemned prisoners. He recognized the sound. He had heard it before, in the damp cells of the jail and in diseased animals he had been called to dispatch. It was the signature of a lung sickness that, once it took hold this deeply in one so young, was almost always fatal. There were no herbs, no secret poultices in his knowledge that could mend this. The boy was dying. Abel looked from the child's pale, sweat-soaked face to the mother's desperate, hopeful one, and he was faced with a choice as stark and terrible as any he had faced on the scaffold. He could tell her the truth, that her son was beyond hope, that she should prepare herself for grief, or he could perform a different kind of service. He could offer a different kind of mercy. He chose the latter. He opened a small pouch he carried at his belt, one that contained a few simple remedies. He mixed a powder of ground willow bark, a common treatment for fever, with a little water and gently helped the boy to drink it. He knew it would not cure the underlying sickness, but it might offer a brief, temporary respite from the fever's intensity. He then turned to the mother. He did not lie to her, not directly. He spoke in a low, calm voice, telling her that the sickness was deep, but that she must keep the boy warm and continue to give him the willow bark tea. He spoke with an air of quiet authority, the same authority he projected on the scaffold. He was performing. He was not offering a cure. He was offering a sliver of hope, a small, fragile shield against the devastating finality of the truth. He was giving her a ritual to perform, a sense of purpose in the face of utter helplessness. He left the small dark room, leaving the rest of the willow bark behind. The mother followed him to the door, whispering her endless thanks, pressing a single, small copper coin into his hand, a payment that felt 1,000 times more honest than the bag of silver sitting in his tower. As he walked away, Back towards the isolation of his own world, he knew that the boy would likely be dead by the week's end. He had not saved a life, but he had, for a brief time, eased a mother's suffering. He had used his fearsome reputation, his grim authority, for an act of complex and ambiguous compassion. It was a strange and unsettling feeling. He was the city's executioner, the man who brought death. But in the secret, shadowed corners of his life, he had just learned that there was more than one way to perform his duty. The encounter with the Weaver and her dying son left a strange and persistent residue in Abel's mind. It was a disturbance to the carefully ordered black and white world he inhabited. His life was built upon stark, simple dualities. He was either inside his tower or outside. He was either the private man or the public functionary. He brought either a swift, clean death, or he did not. The act of offering a palliative, a sliver of false hope, was a venture into a grey and unfamiliar territory. He found himself replaying the scene in the dark, fetid room, the feel of the boy's feverish skin under his hand, the desperate, trusting look in the mother's eyes. He had wielded his fearsome authority not as a sword, but as a balm. The single copper coin she had pressed into his palm felt warmer and heavier than the entire purse of tainted silver. He did not add it to the purse. He kept it separate in a small wooden box where he stored other trifles, a curiously shaped river stone, a single, perfect feather from a hawk. It was an artifact from a different kind of transaction, a different version of himself. In the week that followed, the city of Northgate tried to return to its normal rhythms. The memory of the execution began to fade from the forefront of the public consciousness, receding into the realm of tavern stories and cautionary tales. But a new and more insidious fear was beginning to take root. The sickness that Abel had witnessed in the Weaver's hovel was not an isolated case. Other children in the poorer riverside quarters began to develop the same deep, rattling cough, the same wasting fever. At first, it was dismissed as a seasonal affliction, a lung fever that often culled the weakest during the change of seasons. But this sickness was different. It moved with a quiet, relentless efficiency, and it seemed to have a particular affinity for the young and the old. The city's official response was minimal. The physicians, with their theories of imbalanced humours and miasmas of bad air, were helpless. Their bleedings and purges seemed only to weaken the afflicted, hastening their decline. For the wealthy merchants and guildmasters in their spacious, airy houses, the sickness was a distant problem, a misfortune of the poor who lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. But disease, like the executioner himself, is a great leveller, and it does not respect the boundaries of wealth or station. Abel, from his perch in the Rook's Tower, became an unwilling chronicler of this new, creeping dread. His secret work as a healer, once a rare and desperate resort for those with nowhere else to turn, began to increase. More knocks came at his door under the cover of darkness. A frantic father carrying a feverish daughter, a husband supporting a wife whose breathing had become a shallow gasp. They came to him because the physicians had failed and because the rumor of his intervention with the Weaver's son had begun to spread through the city's hidden channels of gossip. The story had already morphed in the telling. Some said he had cast a spell, others that he had used a secret, almost magical herb. They came to him seeking not just a healer, but a miracle worker, their desperation overriding their fear of his primary trade. He found himself caught in a tide he could not control. He turned some away, knowing from their descriptions that the sickness was too far gone, but others he felt compelled to help. He would dispense his simple remedies, the willow bark for fever, a soothing concoction of licorice root and honey for the cough. He knew these were not cures. They were small acts of comfort, gestures against the overwhelming power of the disease. He was becoming the city's secret physician of last resort, his tower a strange twilight infirmary. He never accepted payment for this work, waving away the offered coins. The single copper from the weaver, Agnes, remained his only fee. This work was not a trade, it was a penance, a private attempt to balance the scales of his life, to weigh these small acts of preservation against the great public act of destruction. Elena watched this new development with a deep and troubled anxiety. She saw the toll it was taking on her husband. He was sleeping even less, his face growing leaner, his eyes shadowed with the weight of the city's suffering. She feared the consequences of his secret practice. What if a grateful patient spoke too loudly of his help? What if the Physicians' Guild, jealous of their monopoly, brought an accusation of illegal practice against him? As the executioner, he was protected in his official duties, but this secret healing left him vulnerable. And more than that, she feared the sickness itself. Each time he touched a sick person, each time he entered a fever room, he was exposing himself, and by extension, her, to the contagion. The thick stone walls of their tower, which had always been a fortress against the hatred of the world, felt terrifyingly permeable to this new, invisible threat. One evening, as Abel was grinding willow bark with a mortar and pestle, preparing for the night's likely visitors, Eleanor finally spoke her fear. She begged him to stop. She reminded him of their isolation, of the fact that if they fell ill, no physician would come to their aid, no neighbor would bring them a cup of water. They had only each other, and he was risking everything. Abel listened to her, his hands never ceasing their rhythmic grinding. When she was finished, he looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a weariness she had never seen before, a sorrow that seemed to spring from a source deeper than his own life. He explained his reasoning in a low, quiet voice. He spoke of the balance of things. He told her that for his entire life, his hands had been instruments of the law's final, brutal word. They had taken life, as was his duty. But now, he felt a compulsion he could not explain to use those same hands to offer what little comfort he could. He said that he did not know if it was a prayer or a penance, but it was something he had to do. He could not stand on the platform as the city's scythe and then hide in his tower when the sickle of disease was harvesting the poor and the weak. In his own strange, dark way, he felt a responsibility. Elena saw the unshakable resolve in his face and knew that she could not change his mind. A new and terrible distance had opened between them, not of affection, but of purpose. He was no longer just the executioner, he had become a shepherd to a dying flock, and she could only watch as he walked into the heart of the plague. The sickness continued its relentless, invisible march. The death toll rose. The sound of the sexton's bell, announcing another passing, became a constant, doleful presence in the city's soundscape. The authorities, finally forced to act, ordered the doors of the sick to be marked with a crude red cross, a sign of warning that transformed homes into prisons. The vibrant, bustling city of Northgate was becoming a place of fear and suspicion, of marked doors and hurried, fearful glances. One evening, a knock came at Abel's door. It was not the desperate, furtive tap of a petitioner, nor the sharp, official rap of the Reeves deputy. It was a weak, frantic scratching. Abel opened the door to find Agnes, the weaver, her face a mask of wild grief. She was not there to thank him. She was there to curse him. Her son was dead. The willow bark had eased his fever for a day, but the sickness had returned with a vengeance, and he had died that afternoon, choking for air. In her grief-maddened state, she had turned on the one who had offered her hope. She shrieked at Abel, calling him a charlatan, a devil who had pretended to offer a cure only to steal the last of her hope. She accused his dark magic of killing her son, not the disease. Abel stood in the doorway, a silent, towering figure, and simply absorbed her rage. He did not defend himself, he did not argue. He accepted her curses as he had accepted her coin, as part of the transaction. He understood that her anger was just another face of her unbearable sorrow, and that he was the only available target for it. He was the city's scapegoat, the vessel for all its dark and difficult emotions, whether it was the guilt of a legal killing or the grief of a senseless death. When her rage was spent and she collapsed into helpless, racking sobs, he said nothing. He simply closed the door, leaving her weeping in the darkness. He turned from the door and saw Eleanor standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale. She had heard everything, the failure of his cure, the mother's curse. It was the confirmation of all her deepest fears. Abel walked past her, up to the small box where he kept his few treasures. He opened it and took out the single copper coin. He held it in his palm for a long moment, then walked to the narrow window and, with a flick of his wrist, threw it out into the night. The gesture was one of finality, of defeat. He had tried to be something other than the executioner, and he had failed. He had tried to balance the scales, but some debts he was beginning to understand could never be repaid. The world did not want a healer from him. It wanted only one thing: the grim, simple, unambiguous certainty of the axe. The tossing of the single copper coin into the void of the night was for Abel a deeply symbolic act. It was the physical exorcism of a fragile and unwelcome hope. It was a conscious decision to slam shut a door within himself, a door that had led to a grey, ambiguous landscape of compassion and failure. He had ventured into that territory and found it treacherous, its paths leading only to curses and a more profound understanding of his own limitations. He resolved, with the cold, hard finality of a prison sentence, to retreat into the stark, unambiguous fortress of his primary function. He was the city's executioner. The law, in its majestic and terrible wisdom, selected the victims. His role was not to question, not to heal, not to balance some cosmic scale, but simply to perform his duty with a clean and terrible efficiency. The rest of the city's vast and accumulating sorrow was not, and could never be, his burden to carry. He reinforced the walls of his self-imposed internal exile with a grim, almost monastic devotion. His days became a structured ritual of mundane, practical tasks. He would sit for hours at his workbench, not a sword in sight, but a collection of his household knives, sharpening them on a whetstone with a slow, hypnotic rhythm until their edges were razor-sharp. He would meticulously oil the great iron hinges on the door of the tower, working the oil into the metal until the door swung with an unnerving, ghostly silence. He re-stitched a loose seam on the thick leather of his jerkin, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and awl, each stitch a small act of order, a tiny victory against the encroaching chaos of the world outside. These were not chores, they were meditations. They were deliberate acts of focus on the tangible, the functional, the world of objects that responded to his will without emotion or argument. He was methodically, painstakingly attempting to rebuild the cold, dispassionate man he had been before, the instrument of the law, a creature of stone and steel. Elena observed this transformation with a heart divided. A significant part of her was suffused with a desperate, guilty relief. The nightly terror of him returning from a sick house, carrying the invisible seeds of the pestilence on his clothes or his skin, began to recede. The immediate physical threat to their sanctuary had lessened, but this relief was poisoned by a deep and abiding sorrow. The man who now sat polishing a buckle for an hour was a harder, more remote figure. The brief, flickering light of the healer she had glimpsed in him, the man who ground willow bark and spoke in low, comforting tones, had been extinguished. He had retreated behind a wall she could not breach, and while their physical fortress might be safer, the emotional distance between them had grown into a vast and silent chasm. The tower had never felt more lonely. Outside their walls, the city of Northgate was engaged in a slow, agonizing capitulation to the disease. The lung fever, once a problem of the poor and the marginalized, had now clawed its way into the respectable heart of the city. Wealthy guildmasters, aldermen, even the Reeve's own wife, were struck down. The pestilence proved to be a terrifying democrat. It cared nothing for social station, for piety, or for wealth. The constant, doleful tolling of the church bells became the city's new, grim heartbeat, a relentless count of the fallen. The great marketplace, the vibrant centre of Northgate's commercial life, was now a place of echoing emptiness. Many of its stalls shuttered, their owners either dead or too afraid to venture out. A new sound became a feature of the twilight hours, the rumble of the death cart. It was a simple, flatbed wagon, pulled by a single, plodding horse, its driver a grim-faced figure immune to the disease or simply too desperate for the pay to care about the risk. His call, "Bring out your dead," was a raw, guttural cry that sliced through the evening quiet, a sound that made people shudder behind their barred doors. Bodies, hastily wrapped in whatever cloth was available, were brought out and tossed onto the cart with a terrible, functional indifference. The consecrated ground of the churchyards could no longer accommodate the dead. Great open pits had been dug in the fields beyond the northern wall, and into these pits the bodies were thrown, unblessed and unremembered, a mass burial for a city losing its soul. One afternoon, Abel stood at his high window, a silent observer of this new, grim reality. He watched the death cart make its slow, inexorable way down the path that ran along the wall. It stopped before the house of a neighboring weaver, a quiet, industrious man whose children's games Abel had often watched from this very window. The weaver emerged from his doorway, his body stooped, his face a grey mask of utter desolation. He carried a small, shroud-wrapped bundle in his arms. With an agonizing tenderness, he placed the body of his child onto the cart. The driver gave a curt nod and the cart rumbled on. Abel watched, his own face a deliberate, stony blank. He felt a flicker of something, a memory of the weaver's son he had once tended, but he crushed it. He turned away from the window, his jaw set. This was the world's sorrow, not his. It was in that moment of turning, a moment of willed and profound detachment, that he saw Elena. She was standing in the center of the room, her hand pressed flat against her forehead, her body swaying almost imperceptibly. She told him, and her voice sounded strange, thin and distant, as if coming from another room, that a sudden, profound weariness had swept over her, a fatigue so deep it felt as if her very bones were turning to water. The light from the window, she murmured, hurt her eyes. Time stopped. The carefully constructed fortress of Abel's detachment was breached in an instant, not by a battering ram, but by a whisper. He stared at her, and every nerve in his body screamed in recognition. He knew these words. He knew this posture. He had seen this exact, quiet, insidious beginning a dozen times in the hovels of the poor. The weariness that was more than tiredness, the sudden aversion to light, the slight, almost invisible tremor in the hands. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his heart a cold, hammering fist in his chest. A dread more vast and personal than any he had ever known was rising in him, a black tide. He placed his calloused palm on her forehead. The gesture was meant to be diagnostic, but it was also a desperate, terrified caress. Her skin was not yet burning, but it held an unnatural, subterranean warmth, the feeling of a low, banked fire just beginning to build its strength. He looked into her eyes, which were wide and luminous, and saw his own stark terror reflected there. She knew, in that silent, shared gaze, the unspoken truth was laid bare between them. For all their isolation, for all their barricades, the sickness had found the one crack in their armor. It was inside their walls. It was inside her. The progression of the disease was a terrifyingly swift and classic litany of horrors. By nightfall, the initial warmth had erupted into a raging fever. She was consumed by great, shuddering chills, her teeth chattering uncontrollably even as she lay buried under every blanket and fur they possessed. The cough began shortly after midnight. It started as a small, dry, tickling in her throat, a sound almost delicate in its menace. By morning, it had transformed into the deep, wet, hollow rasp he knew so well, a sound that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her lungs. He did not need his ear to know what it meant. It was the sound of the body's own fluids becoming the enemy, the sound of drowning on dry land. The next days dissolved into a timeless, sleepless nightmare of helpless care. Abel, the man of grim knowledge, brought all his practical skills to bear on this one unwinnable battle. He brewed the willow bark tea, though he knew it was as useless as trying to dam a river with a handful of sand. He gently forced the liquid between her fever-cracked lips. He kept a constant supply of cool cloths to bathe her burning face. When the chills came, he would lie beside her, wrapping his own large body around her small, trembling one, as if he could impart his own life force to her through sheer proximity. He was no longer the executioner, the healer, or the observer. He was simply a husband, stripped of all artifice, engaged in a desperate, primal struggle against an invisible, implacable foe. The tower, his fortress, became a suffocating, sealed tomb. The silence he had once cultivated now mocked him, broken only by the harrowing sounds of Elena's fight for breath and the distant, maddeningly regular toll of the death bells from the city, each one a reminder of the futility of his efforts. His profound isolation was now a torment. There was no one to call for. No physician would dare cross his threshold. No neighbor would risk contamination to bring a bowl of broth or a word of comfort. All the silver coins from 100 beheadings, sitting inert and useless in their purse, could not buy him a single moment of human aid. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone with the dying love of his life. On the third night, Eleanor's mind broke free from its moorings. She slipped into the wild, surreal world of delirium. She began to murmur, her voice a low, continuous stream of consciousness. She spoke of her childhood, of a white rosebush her mother had planted, of the day her father had first shown her how to properly sharpen a skinning knife. She was adrift, tossed on a chaotic sea of memory. Abel knelt by her side, listening to these fragments of a life he had only partly known, his heart breaking with every whispered word. Then, through the fog of her delirium, her gaze seemed to find him. Her eyes, burning with the fever, focused on his face. A smile of stunning, heartbreaking lucidity touched her lips. "Abel," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of sound. "My kind husband, the healer." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of his defenses. Healer, the title he had so decisively rejected, the failure he had cast out into the night. And yet here, at the threshold of death, it was the only name she had for him. In the unfiltered truth of her delirium, she saw not the feared executioner, not the grim functionary, but the man who had tried to be kind. She saw the core of his intention, not the failure of his action. A great ragged sob tore from Abel's chest. The stoic, stone-faced man collapsed. The carefully constructed walls of his self-control, built over a lifetime of shunning and grim duty, crumbled into dust. He knelt there, weeping, his tears falling onto her hot, dry hand. He was weeping for her, for himself, for the terrible, lonely life they had shared, and for the man he had tried and failed to be. In that moment of absolute devastation, a new and different kind of resolve was born. He could not save her. He knew that, but he would not let her die alone in the terrifying wilderness of the fever. He leaned in close to her ear, his own tears still wet on his face. He took her hand, no longer a healer assessing a patient, but a husband holding on to his wife, and he began to speak. His voice was no longer the commanding tone of the scaffold, nor the calm, authoritative voice of the secret physician. It was the low, intimate whisper of a man speaking to his one true companion. He did not tell her fables or allegories. He began to tell her the story of them. He spoke of their arranged marriage, of the awkward silence of their first shared meal, and how that silence had slowly blossomed into a language of its own, a deep and comfortable companionship that needed no words. He described the way she would look up at the sky from their rooftop garden, her face filled with a quiet joy. He reminded her of a winter storm they had weathered together, safe in the tower, the sound of the wind, a wild music outside their walls. He used his executioner's memory for detail, not to map a victim's anatomy, but to reconstruct the precious, mundane architecture of their shared life. He was weaving a rope of shared memories, a tether for her to hold on to. He did not know if she could hear him. He did not know if he was speaking to her or to the uncaring gods. But in the absolute darkness of his despair, in the heart of the plague that had consumed his city and his home, the executioner was using the only tool he had left, the sound of his own voice, to perform one last, desperate and utterly sincere act of love. The concept of time, with its orderly procession of hours marked by the tolling of bells, dissolved into a meaningless abstraction. For Abel, kneeling on the cold, unforgiving stone of the bedchamber floor, there was only the long, seamless and suffocating darkness of the night, a timeless vigil in a sealed room. He was a lone mariner on a vast, black ocean of despair, and his voice was the only thing that tethered him to the world, the rhythmic, monotonous stroke that kept his own sanity from sinking into the abyss. He spoke on, a continuous, murmuring litany, a desperate recitation of their shared life. He was not telling stories, he was rebuilding a world, brick by verbal brick. He spoke of the way the morning light would catch the faint silver threads in her hair, of the scent of the rosemary she crushed between her fingers, of the quiet, contented hum she would make when engaged in her needlework. He was trying to weave a tapestry of memory so strong and vibrant it might pull her back from the grey, featureless landscape of the fever. He did not know when the words ceased to be for her and began to be for him. They became an incantation against his own terror, a way to fill the profound silence that was broken only by the harrowing, shallow rasp of her breathing. The tallow candles, His only companions in the gloom burned down, their flames guttering and dying in pools of their own greasy wax, one by one, like the expiring lives in the city below. He spoke until his throat was a raw, abraded passage, his voice no more than a dry, crumbling whisper. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion, heavier than any physical labor he had ever known, began to claim him. He had poured out every memory, every observation, every last drop of his spirit. He had nothing left. His words finally failed him, and he slumped forward, his head coming to rest on the edge of the great bed, his cheek against the rough linen of the coverlet, and a black, dreamless oblivion finally took him. He awoke with a slow, thick, groggy ascent, as if clawing his way back to the surface of a deep, dark lake. He did not know if he had slept for minutes or for hours. The first thing that registered in his disoriented mind was the quality of the silence. It was not the tense, waiting silence of the night, a silence defined by the harrowing sound of a struggle for breath. This was a different quiet, a stillness that was deep, peaceful, and absolute. A jolt of pure, ice-cold terror shot through him, a fear that this final silence was the silence of death. He scrambled upright, his muscles screaming in protest, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned his gaze to the bed. The room was now filled with the soft, pale, forgiving light of a new dawn, and in that gentle light, he saw Elena. She was lying perfectly still, her face turned towards him. The frantic, feverish flush that had mottled her skin was gone, replaced by a smooth, translucent pallor. Her lips were no longer cracked and dry. Her breathing was not the shallow, ragged gasp he had listened to all night. It was the slow, deep, almost imperceptible rhythm of a person lost in a profound and restorative sleep. Not daring to trust his eyes, he reached out a trembling hand and laid it on her forehead. It was not burning. It was not even warm. It was cool, blessedly cool to the touch. The great fire had passed. The fever had broken. He stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible. He had witnessed the inexorable, fatal march of this sickness 100 times. He knew its course. He knew that the breaking of the fever was the great crisis, the precipice upon which life and death hung in the balance. But he also knew how vanishingly few ever returned from that precipice. He sank back to his knees, not in prayer, but in a state of stunned, numb disbelief. He did not move for what felt like another eternity, simply watching the slow, miraculous rise and fall of her chest, each quiet breath a refutation of the death that had filled their room for 3 days. She had been to the very edge of the abyss, and she had come back. The days that followed were a slow, sacred, and cautious journey out of the darkness. Eleanor's recovery was a painstaking process, measured in tiny victories. The first sip of water she took without choking, the first spoonful of thin broth she managed to keep down, the first time she was able to sit up, supported by pillows for a few minutes. She was left profoundly weak, a ghost of her former self, her body wasted and frail. But the pestilence itself, the ravenous invader, had retreated. She would sleep for most of the day, but in her waking moments, a new kind of communication began to blossom between them. The great, silent fortress they had built around their marriage had been leveled by the shared cataclysm, and in its place, they began to build something new, with the small, fragile bricks of honest words. She told him of her experience in the fever. She remembered it not as a sequence of events, but as a terrifying, disembodied sensation of being pulled down into a cold, black, rushing river. She remembered the struggle, the feeling of her own spirit growing tired, ready to let go. And then, she said, she had heard a voice. It was not a sound from the outside world, but a presence within the darkness itself. It was his voice. It was, she whispered, a thread of light and sound in the vast, roaring emptiness. It was telling her things she had forgotten about herself, weaving a story that was her own life, and she had held on to that thread, that story, with all her remaining strength. She had followed it, step by step, out of the darkness and back into the light. Her words were not a simple thank you, they were a profound reordering of his universe. He had believed his vigil to be a fool's errand, a desperate and useless gesture against the inevitable. To learn now that his words had been her anchor, her guide, her salvation, was a revelation that struck the very foundation of his identity. He had not failed as a healer. His remedy had not been in the herbs he ground or the potions he mixed, but in the power of his own focused attention, his memory, his voice. The executioner's greatest skill, the profound, detailed observation of a human being, had been turned to its opposite purpose. It had been used not to prepare for a death, but to orchestrate a return to life. The two warring halves of himself, the grim destroyer and the secret preserver, had, in this one ultimate act, become whole. He had finally, in the darkest and most intimate of crucibles, balanced the scales. As Elena slowly regained her strength, the city of Northgate, too, began its own slow, pained convalescence. The pestilence had burned through the populace like a great forest fire and was now beginning to exhaust itself. The death carts made their rounds less frequently. The sound of the sexton's bell became a sorrowful echo rather than a constant, pressing reality. The survivors, gaunt and haunted, began to emerge from their homes, blinking in the sunlight, taking stock of the vast, empty spaces in their families, their guilds, and their hearts. For Abel, however, this slow return to normalcy presented a stark and terrifying choice. The world wanted to forget, to rebuild its old structures and certainties, but he could not. He had been fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The thought of returning to his duties, of descending to the lower chamber, of unlocking the great chest and taking up the sword, now filled him with a revulsion so profound it was a physical sickness. How could the hands that had so gently held his wife's, that had wiped the sweat from her brow, ever again be used to lift a severed head for the gratification of a jeering crowd? The very idea was a blasphemy against the miracle he had witnessed and participated in. He spent long hours in contemplation, no longer polishing steel, but examining the raw material of his own soul. He had been born the son of an executioner, had inherited the trade as a farmer's son inherits a field. He had never conceived of another existence. But the plague had been a great earthquake, shattering the bedrock of the world he knew. It had shown him that a lord's power was meaningless before a fever, that a city's laws were a fragile pretense in the face of nature's indiscriminate judgment, and that the only thing of true, lasting value was the fragile, precious, and sacred gift of life itself. His decision, when it solidified, was not a sudden, passionate impulse, but a quiet, calm, and absolute certainty. One morning, while Elena was sleeping peacefully in the sunlight streaming through the window, he descended to the lower chamber. He stood before the great oak chest, the repository of his family's grim legacy. He ran his hand over the dark, heavy wood, and then, without opening it, he turned away. He climbed the stairs and, with a piece of charcoal on a clean piece of parchment, he wrote his letter to the reeve. The hand that held the charcoal was the same hand that had gripped the sword, but its purpose was now entirely different. His script was clear and steady, with no hint of tremor or doubt. He resigned his office. He recommended a replacement. He signed his name, Abel. It felt like the first truly free act of his life. His final trip to the Guildhall was that of a different man. He walked with his head up, his cowl down, his gaze direct. He delivered the letter into the reeve's own hand. The reeve, a man accustomed to Abel being a silent, cowled functionary, was speechless. He read the letter, his face passing through stages of disbelief, anger, and sputtering indignation. He threatened, he cajoled, he spoke of duty and sworn oaths, but he was speaking to a man who no longer recognized his authority. He saw in Abel's calm, quiet eyes an immovable object, a will that had been forged in a fire far hotter than any civic duty. When Abel returned to the tower, Elena was awake. He simply told her, "It is done." The smile that broke across her face was like the sun rising after a long and terrible storm. The shadows of a lifetime of sorrow seemed to lift from her features, revealing the woman she might have been in a different, kinder world. They left 2 days later, at dawn. Abel's last act in the tower was to place the heavy purse of silver coins and the great iron key to the chest on the table in the main chamber. It was the city's blood money for the city's bloody work. Let the next man carry its weight. They left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a satchel with bread and cheese, and a small leather pouch containing Abel's new tools. a mortar and pestle, some carefully wrapped herbs, and clean linen for bandages. They walked out of the postern gate, not as outcasts, but as pilgrims. The gate, which had once been the boundary of their prison, was now the threshold to their freedom. They were two small, anonymous figures walking into a world scoured by death and filled with an immense, aching need for healing. Abel did not know where the road would lead them or how they would survive. He knew only that he was no longer the executioner of Northgate. He was Abel, and his wife Elena was by his side. He had traded a life of grim certainty for one of utter uncertainty. But as he felt the warmth of the rising sun on his face, he felt a lightness in his soul he had never known. His hands, once trained only to take life, were now free to offer comfort. He was a healer. He had earned the name in the darkest of nights, and he would spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of it. And so, our story comes to a close. We leave our two figures, Abel and Elena, on a dusty, open road, walking away from a life of shadow and into the uncertain light of a new beginning. We do not know what became of them. History, in its grand and often brutal sweep, does not concern itself with the fates of such small and quiet people. There are no records of a traveling healer named Abel, no chronicles that speak of the executioner who laid down his sword. Their story, like so many others, dissolves into the great silent river of the past. But in tracing their journey, we have perhaps illuminated a small, dark corner of a world that is at once alien and strangely familiar. We have seen that the figures we often dismiss as one-dimensional monsters were men, bound by duty, shaped by their communities, and possessed of their own complex inner lives. The executioner, a symbol of ultimate state power, was also a prisoner of it, his life a paradox of public infamy and private isolation. We have followed one such man as he navigated this impossible existence, and we have witnessed his transformation, not through a grand battle or a political upheaval, but through the quiet, intimate crises of the human heart. It is a reminder that the most profound journeys are often the internal ones, and that the most significant acts of courage may not be those performed before a crowd on a scaffold, but those undertaken in the silent, desperate hours of the night in a single, lonely room. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. We hope it has provided not just a story, but a space for quiet contemplation. As always, we are grateful for your presence. Wherever you are in the world, we wish you a peaceful day or a calm and restful night.